Welcome everyone to Never Stay Dead. I'm Damien, also known as Sleepy Reader, here with my co-host.
Hello Internet, it's me, the magical Matthew Dergish.
Here's Matthew.
Woo! So today we're here to talk about a fabulous run of the Fantastic Four. Something that was fresh at the time and historically important to Marvel moving forward.
The introduction of the Inhumans in the early Fantastic Four issues, depending on how you count it, starting in issue 44 or starting in issue 45. They're first named the Inhumans in issue 45. So we're looking at 44, 45, 46, 47, and 48. Is that right? Yep.
A touch
but just
of
the first few pages of 48. So I think it's hard to summarize each individual issue. Shall I just sort of summarize the whole arc a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's the better way to go about it in this case, which is funny for this age of comics. I don't think you get that much.
Right. It's both an arc and written that you could read, or a kid could read each issue completely by itself, too, at the same time, which created a lot of repetition. But basically, actually, I need your help a little bit I can't remember how issue 44 starts, but this guy, Gorgon, shows up because he's hunting for Medusa. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we're having problems with Dragon Man. So throughout the next few issues, we have lots of fights with Dragon Man, big fight with Gorgon, then kind of a break where Johnny Storm just kind of wanders off through a deserted part of New York City and sees a beautiful girl who turns out to be Crystal of the Inhumans. And they have kind of an encounter, and they capture him, and he escapes, and he signals the Fantastic Four, and they all come, and they have a big fight with the Inhumans, especially with Black Bolt. A big knockout fist fight between Black Bolt and the Thing. And there's this guy named the Seeker who's trying to capture the Inhumans, and eventually we learn to take them back to the Great Refuge, the Hidden Land. Is it called the Great Refuge and the Hidden Land? I can't.
I think there's a little bit of naming confusion as with a lot of early Marvel.
And so when the Seeker goes off just with Triton, Reed Richards puts a homing device on his high-tech flying machine, and they follow him to this Great Refuge. To what end? I guess just to kind of spy on them and figure out who they are. At least that's Reed Richards' plan. But Johnny Storm wants to find Crystal again, who he's fallen in love with, even though they've only spoken a few words together. And there we meet Maximus, who is the evil brother of Black Bolt, and has previously, before anything has happened before the comic books happened, he had somehow caused Black Bolt to lose his voice, overthrown him, taken the crown. Black Bolt gets the crown back by literally ripping the crown off Maximus's head and putting it back on his own head.
Right.
And some other little bits of fighting, I guess, happen. Oh, Maximus pulls the trigger on a machine that's going to destroy all humans on the planet, with a big cliffhanger at the end of one of the issues. And then in the next issue, big spoilers here, his machine doesn't work. Humans get shook up a little bit, but they're fine and they survive, which somehow proves to the Inhumans that they are humans too, and we're all the same, and they should come out of their shell. But right at that moment, Maximus pulls the trigger on another machine, which causes a wall of negaforce to surround the Great Refuge, and the Fantastic Four barely escape by using Sue Storm's force field, and so now Johnny is once again separated from Crystal, and they all head back to New York City for the rest of the issue 48, which is the beginning of the Galactus trilogy, which we'll possibly cover in another podcast if Matt can stand it.
Yeah, so this is something from your childhood, right? Like, this is the story you remember fondly.
Well, yes and no, because this was published before I started reading comic books. But I read a few of these issues in reprints right around the same time I started reading the currently published Fantastic Four. So I was a bit confused as I was go back and forth between what was in Marvel's Greatest Comics and what was in the Fantastic Four, called the World's Greatest Comic on the top of it.
I could see that confusion, definitely.
So, yeah, but I have experienced reading this as a 10 or 11-year-old, reading at least some of these issues. And I certainly loved them. And rereading them now, I certainly thought they were comics for children.
All right.
What were your large-scale impressions? Why don't we start with that kind of stuff?
Okay, so this is the first time I'm reading these issues, but I also recently had that bug in my ear from the Black Panther issues we read. And so I don't know. It was a little harder for me with these. This is more what I had a negative impression of the early Fantastic Four being, and hit a lot more of those notes. It doesn't help in particular that it's the Inhumans. I don't know what it is. Any story I've read with the Inhumans just does not jive with me. And I've tried a number of incarnations from a number of different eras, and I just can never get into it.
Any theory as to why
I don't
you can't get into them?
It's just something about the way they're written. A lot of it revolves around Black Bolt, and he's supposed to be this big important character that can't talk, but he also just seems kind of boring, like he's not trying to communicate anything. I don't know. Just none of the characters do anything for me, because they're all written so bizarrely. The only one that kind of grabs me is, I'm going to mispronounce it, Karnak? Yeah.
Karnak? That's how I pronounce it.
Who has the ability to find the weakness in things. That's such an ingenious little idea. But even in it's said explicitly in these issues that they're basically knockoff X-Men. Like,
it is a little bit hinted at, yeah. Or, they're compared to mutants, but then they're
not mutants, they're Inhumans, which to me just feels like a dumb branding thing at that point. Like,
right. And as explained here, I mean, later we get different explanations for them. As explained here, they are basically genetically created mutants, right? Each one is genetically created to have a different
which
power.
To me would feel like less of a thing, because they're also supposed to be tied to the whole celestial Marvel side of things as well.
Right, but that was retconned later. That's not the explanation we're given here.
And I can't help but reading into it because I'm trying to find some...
Last I knew, they were supposedly an experiment done by the Kree like 100,000 years ago on a few humans to create this army of superpowered characters that they would later be able to use when they had to fight other people. For instance, the Shi'ar. I believe they, in fact, later did use the Inhumans to fight the Shi'ar.
That sounds right, too. Yeah, I've never taken much of an interest, so my memory with them is sketchy at best. But
well, my take on the Inhumans, before we move on, is that they make a fascinating short-term thing for the Fantastic Four to visit. But I agree with you; they are in and of themselves a super interesting group of characters. The only one I really like is Medusa,
and she was around before because they mentioned that she'd been there earlier,
right? And it's kind of fun how she went from being a villain to being an Inhuman to later being a member of the Fantastic Four. But I feel like they look really cool, and for 2 or 3 issues for them to show up as supporting characters, so to speak, or sort of mysterious villains, I kind of like them. I really like the hidden world kind of thing, especially the kid in me found that very exciting. And of course, I do get a mix of nostalgia, and I'm both an adult and a child reading this. The sexism really jumps out at me now in these particular issues, more than in other issues we read. He's constantly telling Sue to, shut up and and just do what I say and all this stuff. And that she changes her hairdo and they all call her Ditzy and other things like that.
There's also the bit with Crystal where Johnny's just following her and there's just this kind of this expectation. And I'm like, you just do that? I don't know. It just hit me as odd. Also, Lockjaw's odd.
Well,
in this, he's just described as this dog with antenna, but I'm used to seeing him with the metal like fork in his head that was like a tuning fork, which makes more sense in my mind.
Didn't he have that?
He just has antenna. I mean, it is shaped like that, but later I think it's like a metal like thing in his head.
Oh. But I thought it was a super cool idea then, and I still think it is now, to have a giant, super strong dog who also can teleport you.
I don't like dogs, so I'm not for it. But
now, again, it probably doesn't work well to be explored too closely or something, as it has perhaps been in later Marvel.
Right, and you said earlier it was more for a child or something, and that's something throughout these issues that I feel more than other comics that I've read even from the era is like, it feels like the rules are constantly changing and new things keep coming in. So there's no real semblance, they're just moving from one thing to the next, and there's less weight on any given thing for that, because something's just going to pop around the corner.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you compare it to Spider-Man of the era, Spider-Man was more, I think, self-consciously meant for teenagers to read, and this maybe was more self-consciously meant for 11-year-olds to read. Not that 11-year-olds didn't like Spider-Man, and
because Spider-Man's the coolest.
And they also really go overboard in a lot of... I'm just ignoring that Spider-Man is the coolest. They really go overboard in each issue to sort of reintroduce you to what the characters' powers are and what their psychological issue is. So it's incredibly repetitive. It really was written to be read the way I read it when I was 11, which was you don't get all the issues, and they're months and months and months apart. So it was handy to have those reminders when you were still kind of unfamiliar with the characters. That whole every comic book is someone's first comic, I think, was written back then as every comic book is a lot of people's first comic, and we're focused more on the people who are
right. It was such a different thing back then. Distribution, expectations, the whole thing. Something that grabbed me too is when you look at 46, the cover of 46, Black Bolt looks kind of young, youthful, maybe a little more prototypical of your average Jack Kirby character with his crazy costume. Right. But once you see him in the comic, which he showed up earlier as well, he looks more built, more man than boy.
Right, he's less boyish looking. He almost, I don't know why, but he sort of reminds me of Superman or something.
He has that build.
Kind of a more early middle-aged hero rather than a 20-something, maybe a 30-something.
He has that jawline.
Right. And maybe the body language he's given, he just seems more serious. Now, it struck me more reading this and the way Reed Richards mistreats Sue Storm, it seemed like he was a much older husband who treated her like a child at all times. Like maybe he's 20 years older than her or something, and she's just graduated high school a year or two ago, and that's why he treats her this way.
Yeah, the whole dynamic between Reed and Sue feels super bizarre looking at it now, and I mean, online there's a lot of points about that, people pointing out some of the more egregious examples of how bad it got for a while, but I mean, it's something to think, but it was what, 50, 60 years ago?
Right. Well, yeah, 50 years ago. Okay. 50 years ago. Yeah, and women's lib only sort of became in people's awareness a few years after this. But that doesn't mean everyone was liking women's lib a few years after this. It is interesting. I think it was under Jerry Conway, right around the time I started reading the, at the time, current Fantastic Four, maybe 72 or 71, Sue Storm gave gave notice to Reed Richards that she was divorcing him. And for a while, it seemed like she was going to run off with Submariner.
I think that's a smart move.
And there were a lot of fights between the remaining 3 Fantastic Fours and Submariner. And Sue saying, "No, I want to be with him. Leave him alone." Because they assumed he'd kill her.
All right.
But her reason for divorcing him was not this bad behavior here, if I remember right. It was because he had used some kind of device to put their son into a coma so that he wouldn't destroy the world or something, and she couldn't forgive him for that. But it seemed very modern to me at the time that there was divorce in a superhero comic. But ultimately they did not get divorced. But I think there's been many times where they separate and almost divorce.
I mean, I could see it. That seems like kind of a natural drama point for a family story.
So I don't know. I love the idea of this, and maybe it's just so familiar in comics now, but of this hidden group of people. And maybe, at the time, although I knew of the X-Men slightly, they were not a major player in the Marvel Universe or in the comic book world. So it still seemed very exciting, this sort of hidden group of city of superheroes all hidden away who'd been there for thousands of years. And it kind of evoked that kind of those early 20th century novels where they're always finding lost cities in Africa or in the Amazon jungle.
And that was more the method and mode of the Fantastic Four, right? Is every comic you open, it's some new adventure, some new thing. And I feel like the Inhumans fit that. And if they were just like a footnote, maybe it wouldn't be as much of a thing if they were kind of some lost, group.
Right.
It's just funny to me, though, that, the Black Panther had this grand entrance, before we even see him, we have his herald, and they go to him, it's this very vaunted situation. And with the Inhumans, Johnny kind of sees some girl running down the street, and he kind of just follows her, and things follow from there. It's very unceremonious, and they just kind of happen upon it in the most domestic of terms. There's no scientific, no fantastic way that they get there. And then it's this kind of huge reckoning for the Marvel Universe with, that we won't really see the effect of really for years to come. And I just find it so funny that that's their introduction, is just this girl jaunting down the street with her bizarre dog.
Right. Well, to me, this sequence of issues is kind of the opening salvo of when the Fantastic Four started getting really good. So now you and I have read previously with the with the Black Panther issues, ones that evolved even further from this point. So maybe I remembered wrong, except that this is also the beginning of Joe Sinnott as the inker, and I think once Jack Kirby realized he had such a good inker, he started getting much more inventive, because previous inkers always ruined his artwork to an extent.
All right.
I talked at a convention with Mike Royer, who's the two most popular inkers for Jack Kirby are Mike Royer and Joe Sinnott. Mike Royer later in his career. Mike Royer wonders if the famous Kirby crackle was actually invented by Joe Sinnott, and then Kirby saw it and started using it a lot.
Huh, that's interesting.
But anyway, so it's where the art starts, where the dynamicness of the art kicks up into a much higher notch. And the propulsiveness, what it seems to me, I mean, I think the issues of the Fantastic Four, the early ones, still have lots of good stuff in them, but I think it's starting here where the propulsiveness of so many elements being introduced all the time, and the adventures getting wilder and bigger and more cosmic and more, pseudo-profound, starts. So, and I expected this to be better than it was, because I sort of thought of this as the dividing line, but now I realize it's still more of a
If you took the art on its own, I think it would almost hold up a little better. If you're able to insert some stuff, there's some things I wouldn't have assumed that kind of crop up, like the Reed relationship or certain things around certain characters. The way certain Inhumans talk just drove me weird. And they were supposed to be odd for the time, but,
Right.
This is some comic from way back when, so everyone's talking funny by my standards. And, yeah, it just, some of that kind of weighed on it. But the art is so dynamic, and it tells a story almost on its own. And...
Right. You hardly need to... And there's so much dialogue.
So much filler dialogue in a lot of cases. A lot of what... am I saying it right? Sorry, you said it earlier. Magnus? Okay, I don't want to think it's Magnus, because that's too close to Magneto for me. Maximus.
No, Maximus. So I got the name wrong. So I'm sorry.
A lot of what he says just doesn't need to be said.
Well, I think there was no such thing as silent panels back then. But even beyond that, they love to fill the panels with lots of writing. Now, for me as a kid, it's weird because, and I still sometimes experience this when I read comics with no dialogue, the dialogue helps slow me down. And as a kid, it helped me to spend longer looking at the same picture at each panel.
I can see that.
But that's a flimsy excuse. Now, there are scenes that I thought were particularly good, like when Ben is fighting Dragon Man in Alicia's apartment. What goes on there is a long build-up before he says it's clobbering time. I feel like later on with the Thing, he just says it's clobbering time all the time, but here it built up and built up and built up till he did his really big punch after having battled and struggled. Now, there was lots of dumb dialogue between him and Alicia that I think only a child would buy into, right? They're sort of each wanting to sacrifice for the other in a way. But still, so I felt like scattered throughout here were these moments that kind of had this dramatic power, especially, like you say, if you're ignoring the dialogue. Like the whole way they rescue Triton. But then it's full of dialogue where Reed is putting down Sue. But
yeah. And it's funny because Reed almost seems like a completely different character, because now we have him as kind of this, head of the family, but very upstanding, someone who people respect more than like. And here, he's just kind of that new Sherlock, kind of too smart for anyone in the room, kind of a jerk character. And it's a different thing.
I wonder, if there were diaries kept by Stan Lee, if we could see that, during the period where such and such an issue was written, he was extra busy. It almost feels like he spent less time thinking about the dialogue in this one than, say, This Man, This Monster, or even those Black Panther ones. So sometimes he seems to be taking his time to think about it, and other times he's just vomiting out dialogue.
Well, both of those stories had more of a human element. That in a lot of ways they were smaller stories. And I wonder if that's part of it, is when you start having the crazy sci-fi stuff happening, do you let the flag fly for the supposed super genius for him to just kind of talk down to everyone? I wonder if that was some sort of element. That's something I'm picking up on, but I don't know how much it actually means.
So, and I wonder if at some point in the, they worked on this together for 102 issues. When they started, Marvel was a flop. No one cared about it. It was the loser comic book company that was about to go out of business. Or, they might have thought it was about to go out of business. And they were slowly discovering their own popularity. I wonder if it's sometime in the middle of the Fantastic Four run that they started saying, whoa, this is actually a really popular comic book and it's going to actually last for a while. Let's start putting more effort into it. And so I also feel like this might be the beginning of that. Partially because it segues into the Galactus trilogy, or the Galactus 2.5 issues, but...
Yeah, that is an odd point, is this Inhumans bit is wrapped up in the first 8 pages of the initial Galactus story. And Damien put it to me to only read this Inhuman story, so I saw 1 page with the Silver Surfer on it, and I stopped.
Right, because I'd hoped we would do a separate podcast on the Galactus one, and I wanted Matt to come fresh to that, since he's the newbie on these Silver Age comics.
But I have to admit, even across the Inhuman stuff, issue 48 was more intriguing than most of the rest before it. Like, there is something to it beyond just a change in subject matter. There's something to that issue for the related bits that was stronger. And I think a lot of it was a lack of repetition. Like, finally the story was just moving along and I hadn't just read more or less that and then that again.
Yeah, there's that. And then I thought, it also seems like Jack Kirby just suddenly wanted to move on to the next story, so he just... I bet Stan Lee didn't know he was going to wrap it up in 7 pages. I bet at this point that they were just having the briefest of conversations, and then Kirby was drawing whatever he wanted to. And so I think in the middle of it, Kirby said, okay, I've been doing this a long time. I think I'll just switch to this other idea I have for the Silver Surfer. For all his brilliance, Kirby is kind of very ADD. None of his comics, like that he wrote himself, stick with any one thing for very long.
Well, I think also Kirby wanted to keep things dynamic, and I think he was more of a issue guy, so he wanted each work to kind of stand on its own.
But then we've seen, like in the Black Panther issues, they still call back to what's going on with the Inhumans, and they keep the Inhumans in the picture from then on. And I think a few issues after the Black Panther one, we have Johnny going on a quest to find something that will able to get through the barrier that's keeping him from his true love.
Right.
As an adult, though, I was shocked how there was no basis for their love. I really believed in it as an 11-year-old boy.
Sometimes being pretty's enough. That's what I rely on.
And she loves him. I'm not sure why, just because he's the first teenage boy she ever met.
Yeah, and he's hot.
I guess so. I can't tell. He looks like a Jack Kirby character.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's kind of hard to dig into this one so much because, again, there's that repetition when you went through the story before. I mean, you were summing it up, but every point was hit twice, basically.
Right. Or sometimes 3 times.
And so, yeah, it felt like a clunkier read than a lot of things I'm used to. But, man, the design on it certainly...
There was one point where I guess they're moving giant equipment of reeds out of a room so they can put the Dragon Man into it. And the literal name of the device is something like the iconometer Fremostat. So Stan Lee had no idea what to call these machines and stuff that Jack Kirby was creating. Well, I think, I mean, you complained about Black Bolt, but I think as the center of his own comic book, he's boring, but as a figure appearing in comics, a mysterious, unspeaking character, I don't think we even learn here about the whole thing that he can't speak because sonic explosions.
Yeah, no, he just kind of doesn't talk.
None of that's in there. He just can't talk. And he's getting power through his antenna from radiation or something. I think it was very intriguing, and for a kid, the appearance of Gorgon as this sort of scary figure who's just relentlessly chasing after Medusa, and the Dragon Man, who's this artificial dragon creature with the mind of a child, more like the mind of a puppy dog, I think. But anyway, these are a lot of really fun elements for a great kids comic. It's kind of struck me reading this when it felt so much like a kids comic that all this grown-up, stuff that is now read by grown-ups has spun out of all of this.
Right.
Outside of comic books, you don't really see that. You don't have the Narnia books and then the Narnia books for adults, or at least not directly. I suppose there are now fantasy books, novels that are mostly for adults that are inspired by Narnia or something. But so maybe that was a bad example. But anyway, it's just odd. Or, Gilligan's Island, then Gilligan's Island for adults.
That was Survivor, right?
I guess so.
No,
so I'm completely
I take
wrong.
your meaning.
But it still strikes me as funny that, this empire of entertainment for people 20 and up, mostly, or at least, 14 and up, started with such young material.
Right. I've heard a lot of talk about that, about how comics, grew with a lot of the audience, but at a certain point couldn't bring in any more new audience. That's been something more of an issue.
But of course, you were a new audience.
Well, yeah,
Remember.
and so, I definitely... It's funny to me, though, I have some opinions of stuff where, in particular around Spider-Man, like, people say, well, Spider-Man needs to be a teen, that's how they connect with him. When I came to Spider-Man, he was looking at being a dad in a lot of ways as much more of an adult than he is now.
Right. Yeah. So part of the problem is us old people constantly saying, oh, it should be the way we remember it. But apparently a lot of us old people still buy a lot of comics.
Right. There's that conundrum.
So that kind of skews things.
The only hard, fast, in my day it was this way that I have a hard time getting over is an X-Men team without Cyclops. That just never feels right to me.
Right. Well, you're eventually stuck in your own... you're now old enough to start being stuck in your own nostalgia a bit. For what the X-Men were like, what Spider-Man was like when you started, what the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were.
Well, I don't love X-Men right now.
And
but...
that's something that you've grown up with, right? The Ninja Turtles, when you started, I assume you were watching kids' cartoons for them first and then discovering more sophisticated versions of them.
Right, though there's a harsher break. The Turtles are more interesting in that respect because they have different incarnations. And it's not like this continuous story, right. So I feel like when they break and they're a little different, or the origin changes, it's more natural. And also, the kids' cartoon was the kids' cartoon. You pick up the comic, it's different tone, visual, the whole thing. And so it just has this different feel. Especially the old Mirage.
Yet, without the kids' cartoon, you wouldn't have known who they were, right?
That's true.
So it was your intro to them. You knew who they were. You knew the basics of their story and their world. And it helped you. Maybe there was a big bump up. I maybe am in a particularly privileged position being in my mid-50s now. Because when I started reading in the 70s, some of the comics were a little bit above my age grade. But a lot of them were still at my age level. So I started with Fantastic Four and Avengers and stuff. And then as I got a little older, that's when Marvel started doing their horror comics, which, felt a little older. And then by the time I was in college, it was Frank Miller and Alan Moore. And then by the time The Watchmen came out, I was in my mid-20s, so it almost seemed like the world was designed for me in comics until about 1991, where that all fell apart.
In more ways than one.
But,
I can see what you're saying. In some ways, though, I feel like I have some benefit of gaining faster hindsight. Like, the one character that I felt really harshly about at the time was Deadpool, because I was kind of enjoying this character moving along with it, then suddenly it wasn't my Deadpool. And looking back, I still stand by that, because Daniel Way is not a good choice for writing Deadpool, but he's had the longest run. Does he now? Right. Anyways.
But, Dugan must have been a long time now. They
both had long runs. I don't know who had the longer run at this point. Especially because with the renumbering, it's harder to count. Because technically Dugan had 3 runs, but one of them might have been 8 issues. Right. Besides the point. But one of my favorite characters was originally introduced in an early Fantastic Four, I believe it was annual, the Multiple Man. And going back and reading early incarnations of the Multiple Man it's a different character than the Jamie Madrox that I know and love from Peter David's second take on X Factor.
Right.
I mean, and I love that character, but going back and reading some of the earlier stuff, I could care less. That's not that guy.
Well, I think Marvel is much more trapped than DC, with people having their version of somebody that they can't let go of.
Yeah.
Because Marvel, early on, when I started reading Marvel, the Marvel Universe was literally 10 years old. And really probably had only coalesced 5 years before I started reading. So I could still feel it was all one thing. And for most of the 70s, a lot of the writers were still doing their best to follow in the footsteps of Stan Lee. But then after that, you have to get new versions of everything. It's just not possible to do it any other way. But there's this illusion with Marvel of continuity. Whereas with Batman and Superman, they were so ridiculous in the Silver Age and in much of the Bronze Age that you're much more willing to just accept, okay, here's someone's new take on Superman, someone's take on Batman. Although we do complain a lot about Tom King's take on Batman.
Bad comics are bad comics, notwithstanding a particular character take.
My own problem is with Tom King's take on Batman. But I'm never completely happy with anyone's take on Batman because I have my own Batman in my head.
Yeah, so Batman's a weird character for me because I don't like Batman. But I like the world Batman's in. I like the side characters of Batman a chunk. So I care more about how Tim Drake's written in a given thing. But for the most part, I feel like Tim Drake's been written fairly consistently. I mean, he was a little more extreme in the 90s in a more fun, bizarre way, but it was the 90s.
And I can't really speak to that since I didn't read Tim Drake.
You have some grand reading ahead of you, dear friend. There's a great Goldfinger reference in an early issue. There's Asbats choking Robin out, forcing him to leave the...
Well, I'd rather read DC from the 90s than Marvel from the 90s, that's for sure.
I've been going through some different things, and it depends what characters, what writers. There's good stuff happening in the 90s. It was just in none of the main books. Because the writers... Because the bankruptcy was happening, so the creators almost had more freedom, I feel, in a lot of ways, because if it was a B-book they were trying, they're like, just try to make it good, And I think the editors didn't trust themselves, so they were a little more willing to let different things happen.
Well, I do have the sense in the late 90s, things really freed up, and writers were really trying all kinds of different things. I guess I haven't looked close enough at Marvel in the 90s. I just sort of start with my general impressions from the early 90s and moved on.
Yeah, no, there's some great... there's some great stuff, especially really late 90s, which is basically hinging on or leading into a lot of the early 2000s stuff.
It's funny, though, I'm putting down the idea that you can't go back and everything, but when I've been reading Marvel 2-in-1, written by Chip Zdarsky with Ben Grimm and Johnny Storm, I've been really enjoying it. And although it's clearly done as a modern comic with big splash pages and not tons of dialogue, it still kind of somehow touches back on those old memories of mine. And then I was saying I wonder if Dan Slott can pull off the same trick of kind of writing a modern comic book that has some satisfying throwbacks to the old Fantastic Four.
I'm sure he can. Look, Dan Slott did a lot of bizarre and interesting throwbacks throughout a Spider-Man run that proved, he knew Spider-Man and knew where to pull. And there were some flubs along the way, but the man wrote the comic for a decade. And I have a feeling he may not be as familiar with the Fantastic Four, but I'm sure he's very familiar with the Fantastic Four. And I just imagine that he'll be able to pull that together. I just think Dan Slott is a powerhouse that is somewhat underrated.
Well, I would agree just based on how much I loved his Silver Surfer. And obviously the Silver Surfer connects to the Fantastic Four.
Well, I'll find out.
Now there he was helped a lot by, for me, because I know you don't like this artist, he was helped a lot by working with Michael Allred, who evokes that retro feeling all on his own.
If retro's flat, then I agree.
Someday you're going to suddenly say, whoa, I do like Michael Allred.
He's done some alright stuff as just an artist, but a lot of it is I really tried to dig into Madman, and I could not.
Madman. Oh, okay. I heard it sounded like Batman, but Madman. Yeah. I don't think I like his writing either. I like it when someone else is doing the writing. He and Dan Slott gave us what felt like a Michael Allred comic, but then I go read a Michael Allred comic and I say, boy, this is disappointing. I wish Dan Slott were writing it. So Dan Slott somehow got that essence of what seems cool about Michael Allred and put it into his script, I guess, I feel.
I guess every time I look at Michael Allred art, it just feels flat to me.
Well, it is. It's purposefully flat, which is kind of disorienting. He doesn't do a great job with different levels of perspective and stuff.
Yeah.
And he doesn't seem to want to.
Boy, that sounds like a great artist.
It's kind of underground almost, but not anymore, obviously, because he's done a lot of mainstream comics now.
Yeah. So, and here's the thing. If you like Mike Allred, all the more power to you. I don't have anything particularly against it. I don't like it. It's not my bag.
It's funny, though, to me, that you liked Ed Piskor, but not Mike Allred, because that was also seeing all those superheroes done in a more kind of flat, non-dynamic style.
I could kind of see what you're saying, but Piskor is doing all these intricate detail things, and what he's doing is he kind of creates just kind of this level playing field so that all these crazy elements come together and they feel balanced out. It just makes any random aspect of the X-Men coming in feel like it fits by having this art style that makes everything somewhat look uniform. It fits what he's doing. I feel like if I was reading just an average Marvel comic put out with Ed Piskor art, it wouldn't grab me nearly as strongly. But for what we were going through, it really fit.
Well, I felt that Allred's, in the same way, really fit with the way they did the Silver Surfer. As a slightly tongue-in-cheek, slightly knowing comic booky book about cosmic adventures with weird aliens. And
maybe I need to give it a shot. I honestly didn't check it out because of Allred.
Yeah. There have been times when I found Allred, like at one point he did a fill-in issue on Daredevil, and it was like, oh god, this just looks awful. What a mess.
Well, and coming off of who was doing Daredevil at the time? Samney?
I think it was Chris Samney at the time. If not, it was Marcos Martin. It was one or the other.
Yeah, which that's not fair. Those guys are incredible.
But I can't help at moments. Eventually, I got into Piskor. This is all referring back to what we talked about in our last podcast, in case you missed it, in the Grand Design, X-Men Grand Design. But there were moments where I was like, comparing it to Jack Kirby in these Fantastic Fours we read today, or talked about today and read recently. Every panel has things just kind of moving in and out at you and coming from all directions. And then Ed Piskor is almost like drawing across a line, a flat diorama or something, compared to Jack Kirby. But after a while, I gave up on the Jack Kirby dynamics while reading the Grand Design and got into what Ed Piskor was doing, which is just a different aesthetic.
Totally.
But that's another thing, with superheroes, is accepting new art styles and such.
Right. Though there are art styles that just never seem to work, and they quickly fade.
Well, some do. Well, like, people hate the art style in Squirrel Girl. And I can't say I totally love it, but I've learned to appreciate it after having read so many issues of Squirrel Girl with my daughter.
I like Squirrel Girl. I think that's fine. When I was saying that, I was thinking in particular of some CGI or badly digitally rendered comics that I saw.
I certainly hate those
stuff
too.
That faded quickly.
Well, maybe it turns out I am getting Dan Slott's Fantastic Four, because I didn't remember, but I put in for a Marvel mail subscription to it. So maybe once I get that, we could just do a quick podcast where we talk about what we think of the first issue.
We can do that, but we should let our listeners know first what our next episode's going to be, which you don't know, but I do. And we might expand on this, but because we get to swap between issues, I know Damien's next one will be Galactus. I wanted to keep the Kirby train running.
Oh, really?
And do an issue of the Ninja Turtles.
Okay.
That is a dedication to Kirby that happened in the moment of his death. Because a lot of people, when they talk of the Ninja Turtles, attribute a lot to Frank Miller and his influence, because the Daredevil connection's obvious.
Right.
But they were also very big fans of Kirby, and there's a lot of elements of Kirby throughout their comics. I mean, namely the mutant turtle part came more from Kirby than Miller.
It didn't come... I mean, because at the time, the two popular comics were the X-Men and Daredevil. So it didn't come just from Claremont's X-Men. It was more Kirby X-Men kind of thing.
Well, I mean, this kind of like monster... And when you see some of the art and some of the ways they play on Kirby in this issue, I think it makes more sense. After reading this issue, that's what I made the connection to. So maybe it's just me.
No, I definitely make the connection between their art style and Kirby, so I totally buy into that.
Right. So, and maybe you'll read more than just this one, because it would just be one issue, and it might be hard to just do a single issue. But Donatello.
We had talked about eventually reading some of those classic ones that are either colored or not colored, depending on where we find them.
Right, and this might just be replacing all that, but I thought with it being a tribute to Kirby, it might give you a little...
Tie our two interests together.
Yeah. And this is just one issue of comics I want you to read very badly, so I'm going to make an assignment.
It should be noted that I did go through a short period of reading Ninja Turtles because Matt was recommending them, and I did enjoy them very much, but somehow I let them slip by. And I actually, in that run at the time, it was Sophie Campbell, but she wasn't called Sophie Campbell then, and then someone else took over. And when that someone else took over, I stopped reading them, but I kept buying digital copies as they came on sale. And so I still have a backlog of those to read somewhere in my iPad.
Oh, man. And now those are retro.
Right. You've moved on so far from those, you probably don't care. But
I mean, I care. I love all of them. But, yeah. I think this Kirby one-shot... No, the Kirby one-shot. It's the Donatello micro series, and then maybe, depending on how we can access that, maybe talk about a couple of the other micro series that were just named after... They gave each turtle their own single issue. And they're all, except the Leonardo one, not that it's bad, it's just in continuity with something else that doesn't make any sense on its own. So.
Well, that sounds good. I look forward to reading it. And then after that, we can return and take a quick look at this Galactus trilogy.
Yeah, so we have, like, plans and designs for...
We just have to find the time to actually get together and talk. But and we will not stay dead, though. We will be back.
Never stay dead.